That doesn't mean we didn't need the discipline sometimes, but that was a correction of an action, not a correction of who they were as a person.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Dare to Raise Daniel podcast. We have an exceptional guest on today, and I'm going to define him as the most interesting man in the world. I don't know if you remember the commercials from maybe the 2000s where you would come across someone and they would constantly say, oh, and they did this, and they did this, and they did this. And you're like, wait, what? Pretty amazing. So today I have with me Mr. Ron Stebbins. Just a quick bio of what I've learned. Grew up in a little bit of Arkansas and Louisiana, had a broken home, moved to Dallas, started a family, started a business. That business did very well. And then at 51, he decided to run for Texas House of Representatives and was elected, and has worked with John Maxwell and even has an audio of Ronald Reagan in his audio book, Leadership from the Little Red Wagon. So welcome on the show, Mr. Ron Stebbins. Tell me what I missed.
Well, thank you very much for I'm glad that you used that $20 I sent you to good use there. But no, thank you. I'm excited to be on here, Joel, and thank you for what you're doing with your podcast. I've listened to a few of them, and you really hit on some really good subjects. So I appreciate you doing that.
Well, praise the Lord, and thanks for being on it. And I'll be honest, I didn't know who you were. I also like to listen to podcasts. I was listening to your daughter's podcast. Some of you may know Allie Beth Stuckey. Ron was guest hosting, and he gave out his email and just said, hey, if you have any questions, ask. And it's like, well, we do have questions. So let's start with some questions. Okay. One of the things I have noticed on the Allie Beth Stuckey show is that, or relatable, she has an ability to discern current events and make a wise judgment. Today in our world, parents are saying, okay, how can I help my child view what's going on, determine what is truth, and how should I respond? My first question from one of my listeners, Allison, and she asks, what did you find that was helpful to instill compassion for others while standing firm on what you believe what you believe is truth? So when you hear a situation, how do you stand firm on principle, but how do you say, okay, it's the balance of compassion, the 30,000 foot view and the 10-foot view?
Well, I think that you first of all have to believe that all truth has compassion inside of it, because leading people down a road where it's compassion without truth is really causing more harm than it is good. And so in order to do that, and the way that Lisa and I, my wife and I, tried to do it is to, first of all, you have to start with some type of grounding. And for us, and hopefully for most of your listeners, it was, a Bible-based grounding. We've gone to churches that would be considered pretty conservative churches over our entire life. When we first moved my family has been Baptist for 300 years, so you can blame all of my faults on that. They've been in this country since 1626, and have been Baptist. A lot of Baptist preachers during that time. And so when we moved to Dallas, we went to First Baptist Dallas. At the time, the great W.A. Criswell was the pastor there. A lot of people would know who he is, especially people in our era. Some of the younger people may not. And, I just never forget what Dr. Criswell said one day. He says, I believe the Bible from Genesis to maps. And so that was our family foundation. And we, there might be some different interpretations based on what translations you're looking at and whatever. But the basic principle that all truth is God's truth is where we founded that on. And then as you head into the Gospels, of course, the compassion, and there's plenty of compassion in the Old Testament too, because a lot of those times, God could have done a lot worse to them than he did. He absolutely was a God of forgiveness to the Israelites. But as we move into the Gospels, you see compassion just overflowing with truth in Jesus' actions and in the actions of his disciples and the apostles that follow him. So I think that's how you have to do that. You have to go back. What's your foundation? Okay. And, one of the things that we also had in our family was, and this didn't happen overnight, it evolved. It was, what are our values? And one of our key values was truth, and that we wanted to make sure that we spoke the truth, but that we also, and I've failed at this many times, is do it with trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes. When I joined the legislature, I'm glad you mentioned that because there's some pretty good stories with that. When I joined the legislature, I had been in business for a long time, so I knew business, and I assumed incorrectly that the legislature would be just like business. So when they say, "Hey, we want you to run government like a business," there's some merit to doing parts of that, but it doesn't work totally. It's a little bit uh, like an oxymoron in some ways. And so, but what I did is I did innately know through my experience that almost everything is relationship. Whether you're running a church or a family or a business or in government, it's really all about relationships because we're dealing with people. And so what I did, there are 150 representatives, House state representatives in the Texas House. And so what I did for the first 70 days that I was in Austin at the Capitol, I went around and met with all 149 other reps. 15 to 20-minute meetings, no real agenda, just to get to know them because I knew that I needed to understand when I might be debating with a person across the aisle from Brownsville, Texas. I needed to understand him personally so I could at least have some compassion for where he was coming from. Now, he might be totally wrong on policy, in my opinion, but I needed to see him for who he was and why he might be taking that position. So, I, as we raised our family, we've tried to instill that in our kids, and their moms does a much better job of that than I do. I'll tell you that. But I think that they have done that, and I see that coming out in Allie's podcast for sure. Our oldest son is an assistant U.S. attorney in San Antonio, and for the Western District, which includes it's the largest U.S. attorney's district in the country. And I see it in him, and he has to deal with some pretty bad hombres, and so it can get pretty complicated. But I also see the compassion that comes out in him to making sure that he's not just attacking, but he's also being just as well.
And so, following up on that, let's pretend that we're in the Simmons home and it's a night where there weren't tons and tons of events going on, and you guys happen to have a family meal together. What did that look like? And we'll say, I don't know who's older, but maybe you had a junior higher and you had a high schooler.
Yeah, well, we have, there's three kids in our family, and our oldest is 10 years older than Allie Beth. And then our second one, our son Daniel, which is a great name of your podcast,
Yes.
is 7 years older. So there was a pretty big gap between the boys and Allie. But Allie, as most of you can probably believe that's watched her, she kind of came out pretty smart. I mean, she just, her mom did a lot of work with her, but she's always been able to process information, even as a little girl, pretty well. So she could participate in our conversations. But in a typical scenario, even though had an investment business, so that was my primary time spent. We definitely were talking about current events. I became an adult when Ronald Reagan was president. I was voted my first presidential election when he was president. And then we went through our boys and some of their formative years. We went through Bill Clinton and the challenges that he had personally, okay, versus some of the good work that he did from a government standpoint, especially as it relates to spending. Last time we had a balanced budget was when Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House and Bill Clinton was president. And there were a lot of things we disagreed with him on, but So we were using those current events, maybe subconsciously, to try to help our kids understand as they're out in the world right from wrong, right? And so we would talk about whatever happened to be going on at that particular time in the news, and it would be politics. We weren't actively engaged in politics other than maybe doing some donating to some people we followed and certainly voting. But I was not a in the Republican Party per se, as far as being super active. But and I also think that the education they had really helped them. They went to a private Christian school that very much was focusing on not only a Bible based education, but also what was going on in the world around them to be prepared for that when they left. So my wife did a really good job of that. She did a really good job of raising real good apologists, right? Biblical apologists. And I think that's been helpful for them. But we probably we'd talk about sports and all that type of stuff. But we definitely were talking about current events. And I encourage people to do that. Do not protect your children from current events. They need to be ready to think about that.
Okay, I appreciate that. All right, my next question comes to us from David. He wants to know about your dad in the past, and also, so what did you learn from your father regarding fatherhood? In his particular circumstance, he did not have a good father,
Yeah.
and had to kind of reinvent the wheel. And I don't think he was aware that you probably had similar circumstances going on as well.
That's interesting. And actually, I've spent a lot of time in my life thinking about that. I'm still I still in communication. I still have a relationship with my dad, but my mom and dad divorced when I was a teenager, and that was very hard on all of us kids. It just was, and I don't want to place blame on where it all went around because I don't know all the details myself, and honestly, don't really even want to know them. But it did create the time leading up to the divorce for a couple of years. You could tell things weren't going well, and then when they divorced, I was 17, and it certainly created a huge gap between my dad and myself. And so some of what I learned was what I swore not to do. Okay. And obviously one of those things was that when Lisa and I got married, we were only leaving in a coffin. We're not leaving any other way. And she was committed to the same thing. Now, her mom and dad, stayed together the whole time. But but I did. My dad is a very good person as far as he's a nice guy. He's very good with people. He had natural personality like that. But I would say that the things that I did learn from him were we moved around quite a bit when I was younger. He was a school teacher and also led the music in small churches, and so we moved around some. And I that did help me understand how to be comfortable in new surroundings. Right? I mean, if you grew up in the same house with the same people in the same small town, it might be difficult for you. So it was easy for me, which I appreciate that about him. I didn't appreciate it then, but I appreciate it now that I'm very comfortable in moving into new scenarios. And I think that's very helpful. But what I did learn, okay, is that I needed to all those places where I might have resented my dad for not being there or not being there to give me advice or being there to help me out financially when I needed it. That actually was a driving force to make sure I was checking those boxes. And so for this young man, that's what I would use it as. At some point in time, and listen, I struggle with this even in some ways today. We have to get past being hurt by that, right? And it's difficult to do. It's difficult for young men. And it's very difficult for women too, for their dads, And we have to get past that, and we have to use what we learned from that, either negative or positive, so that we can put the right things in place for our family.
Okay. Thank you. Um, Following up, this is from Natalie, and she talks about the hustle and bustle of everyday life and managing birthdays, holidays. She actually has young kids and just says, it feels like sometimes we're the outsider looking in as our kids are growing up, trying to manage everything. How do you survive and yet smell the roses?
Yeah, I think that that's certainly something that changed from when I was a child. And I don't know about you, Joel, but when I was a child, we just didn't have all the I mean, I played sports and obviously went to church and participated in those, but we didn't really have all of these activities that took up so much of our free time in the evenings or on the weekends and things like that. So we had, and it certainly began as our kids were growing up. And what we determined is that we were never going to put those things first. They were not going to be first. If we wanted to take a vacation and go to whatever for 2 weeks, and we did our best to make sure that they didn't, miss too many ball games, but that wasn't going to be our deciding factor. We put what we were going to do as a family first. And if we could coordinate some family things around those others, that was fine. But we put those things first. And I've seen Justin and Allie, our middle son Daniel doesn't have any kids. I've seen them do the same thing, and I think that's what you have to do. Where's your priority? Your kids aren't going to even remember every game
Right.
or every recital or whatever. You got to make memories with your family that includes everybody, not just their memory of playing in some sports activity, in some random Wednesday evening.
Sure. Very good. Thank you. This question comes to us from Brad, and he basically says, kind of along the lines, what's the best advice that you could give regarding parenting? And, subcaption below and above, what'd you do well? What did you not do well? Ultimately, what's the best advice you could give?
The best advice that I could give for parenting is to, again, this sounds trite, but you need to know where your truth foundation is, and you don't need to change from that. And your kids will see that. They will watch you. It's been amazing as our kids have been adults, as they've come back and talked about just the things that they picked up on with us. I've told this story before that really one of the best things I've ever received from either of my kids. And it really was a passing comment in a way for Justin, the oldest, is he said, Dad, one thing I appreciate about you is you've never participated in anything that was degrading to mom, verbally or anything, and you don't participate in, off color comments and jokes and things like that. And I wasn't even aware of that. I mean, particularly, right? But he was watching that. All right. So having your own foundation, okay, of truth is important as well. And I think that's the best thing you can do because they're going to watch you every step of the way. Now, the second thing, though, which is pretty close to being as important, is you have to be present with them in whatever stage of life they are. Like where our kids are adults now, our presence is different. All right. My presence with them, of course, is enjoying their kids, our grandkids, but it's also being there for advice, counsel, and not telling them what to do, but being able to provide insights on, well, hey, this is what it was when something like this happened to me, right? Those types of things. And I think that's a good indication of your relationship with your kids is when they become adults, will they still come back and talk to you about things that are on their mind or things that are important to them? And I would say the worst thing that I did, and this is something that is we didn't learn this till really Allie was a teenager, and that is I saw everything in our family world that I wanted done as an absolute rule. It was my rule, and therefore you had to do it. We learned in when Allie was a teenager, because she and I have very similar personalities. So Lisa was caught in the middle, and it was difficult. So we found a good Christian family counselor, and he said, "Ron, you've got to understand the difference between values, which are only three or four, rules, which are less, and preferences. You're making all of your preferences rules. Like if I wanted Allie to keep a spotless room, that was as she got older, that should be more of a preference than a rule. So, and we really had to sit down literally, Joel, and write them down on a whiteboard. We wrote them down and we agreed on them. And so the worst thing that I did was not realizing that early on. And with my boys, see, the challenge is with my boys, they were very much like their mother personality wise, very easygoing. You could say, Justin, it's time to go to bed. Okay, no big deal. You say, Allie, it's time to go to bed. We're going to have a discussion about that, right? And so we didn't realize, because our boys were so compliant, the need to have that. Okay. They didn't push back very much. Well, when Allie came along, and as she got older and obviously more self reliant and independent, we thought, man, what is going on here? And that made us realize an issue. And I'm so thankful that it did, because it helped us. And I think it helped Allie see that now in her kids, and Justin see that in his kids.
Would you happen to have an example of a value, a rule, and a preference that you guys determined looking back?
Yeah, a value would be what we talked about earlier, truth. Okay, we're going to have truth in our family. We're also going to have respect for each other. We're not going to bad mouth other family members. I did not want to hear Justin talking negative about Allie, or Daniel talking negative about Justin, or any of that. We weren't going to do that. That was a value. Okay. And mom and dad weren't going to do that either, right? That doesn't mean we didn't need the discipline sometimes, but that was a correction of an action, not a correction of who they were as a person. So those would be values. A rule would be, Allie, at age 16, you have to be home at 11 p.m. That's a rule. And everybody that you go out with has to come sit with me in my office first. That was a rule. A preference would be, hey, Allie, as a teenager, you got to eat everything on your plate at dinner, or you have to keep your room to this specification, or you have to cut your hair this way. Now, there could be some things that were extreme on that we might have to deal with, but we didn't. So that's how you look at that. And as your kids are little, you're going to have a lot more rules, very few preferences. Okay. Now, what we have in today's society, a lot of young parents are wanting the kids to have they're wanting to all be preferences. You can't do that when a kid's too young. He's got to have that foundation where his or her barriers are. And you're going to have a bunch of very few preferences, a bunch of rules, but the values never change. Okay. You're going to teach those values from day one.
I really like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question I have is basically, so parents that, let's say their kids are getting older, mom has sacrificed to be with the kids at home, and now she is really looking for some more worth and value when she spent, most of her time focusing on her children. Someone I had an opportunity to chat with, and he was kind of explaining what was going on in their home. So it's not a question from him, but he was just asking for prayer.
Yeah.
What advice would you give? And typically it's a mom who's like, man, I have really pushed the red wagon for a long time, and
Yeah.
I need help.
Well, I tell you what, that is a great question, because that's so interesting that you say, because I've struggled with that myself, not with me, but with Lisa, right? Because she was a stay-at-home. She taught for a couple of years, school. She's educated, teacher education, but she definitely, the thing she's always wanted to do since she was a little girl is to be a mom, and she did a great job. It still does a great job of that. But when Allie left, I thought, okay, now this is pride in Ron, right? your guys probably not thinking that. I thought, okay, well now it's going to all be about me. She's just going to come take care of me. Well, that wasn't exactly her plan either. And so what she has done, although it didn't happen immediately, she has interests that she is now engaged in. She's musically oriented. So she's become and she's really thrown herself into songwriting. She works with some professional people. She's written quite a few songs. She goes to songwriting retreats, which when I can, I will go with her just as support, just which I love doing and I think she appreciates. But it took her a while to figure that out. There's no question about it. And of course, for me, I was thinking, I'm sure this gentleman's thinking the same thing, sweetheart. You've shown your worth is out there. Your kids and your grandkids and how they are. You did most of that, right? But there's still a desire in people to continue to have additional worth. And so I just think that what he should do is just say, sweetheart, I'm going to support you in whatever it is that you want to do. Obviously, there's reasons, reasonableness to all that, but whatever it is you want to do. And I can't, but he can't make the decision for her. See, when I would try to say, well, why don't you do this or why don't you do that? And they may have been decent ideas, and she was always kind about it, but it needed to come from within her soul, maybe something the Lord was guiding her on. And I really just needed to stand back. And so it took us a while to figure that out. And I don't know that we have it perfectly figured out today because she also has conflict now that we have grandkids. Okay, how much do I want to focus on what this is I'm doing? But I want to make sure, and we are, but that I'm super engaged in my grandkids' life, right? So I think as a husband, we just have to be supportive of whatever they want to do and realize it's just important to them as us having whatever career we had was to us.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. That's good advice. So one of the things I mentioned at the beginning is that you've written a book. It's called is it Leadership from the Little Red
Life lessons and life
Life Lesson?
lessons from the little. I think I got one right here. Life lessons from the Little Red Wagon.
Very cool. And
So it's kind of a neat book. Yeah.
it has 15 lessons that you've learned.
Yep.
Would you be willing to share one of those to get
Sure.
people excited about that?
Yeah. Well, the one lesson that I really enjoy, and I forget which chapter it's in, but it's called Taking the Next Uncomfortable Step. And I think what happens for a lot of us is, especially nowadays with our phones and all technology, we can kind of stay in our little world where it's very comfortable. However, whatever that world you want it to be, you can essentially create that. And therefore, I think it keeps us from growing as people and also advancing in whatever it is that we're doing, whether that's in our relationship, whether that's in our job, whether it's in our spiritual life, because we're comfortable. So you don't really do things extra until you're uncomfortable. So what I talk about in here is, look, if your goal is to, when I started out our business, I didn't have a goal that said, okay, we're going to get to $3 billion and sell the company for a decent amount of money, 3 billion under management. I had a goal of, hey, I want to end financial mediocrity in my family line. And so what if I would have only thought about that $3 billion scenario out there as assets under management in our investment company, I think it would have overwhelmed me. But here's what I did know. I know in order for me to have any chance of moving forward, I had to take the next uncomfortable step, whatever that was. For me, as a young 27-year-old, that means getting on a plane, flying to some city around the country, uh, having a meeting with a potential client at 27 years old. And these clients were generally close to age 60 because they were all retired commercial airline pilots. and asking them or trying to convince them to have our firm manage their life savings. Now, that was not comfortable, okay? But it's something that I needed to do, and it was just the one step. And so, whatever that one step is, just take the next uncomfortable step. Don't try to take three steps, take the next one, and then that'll lead you to the next one. But you got to be willing to take that, to make that extra phone call, or to I really need to close the loop on that relationship conflict I was having. Or, I've said I wanted to get my college degree, then I need to sign up for that online course that gets me towards that one step. So that's the way that's one of the most important lessons I think that I've learned, and also I would recommend people do as well.
So, in order to change, it takes uncomfortableness and being
Yes.
willing to take that next step. But if you look at the big picture, it can be too daunting. But it's just this day and that day moving
That's
forward.
right. That's exactly. I mean, I just all we did in our business was just one day at a time. We really it just worked. Now, when you look back on it, it seems, oh, those guys had a master plan. Da, da, da. Just, I promise you, it wasn't like that at all. And
Sure.
some days we took a step backward, right?
Right.
For sure.
So, real quick, if you don't mind, just telling people the concept of the little red wagon. So, those of you that are listening, you can see it in your background. You actually have a little red wagon on your wall or your bookshelf,
Right.
and you break apart the elements of the wagon. And where are you in these elements? Would you mind sharing that briefly?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The reason I use the red wagon is because it's a childhood toy that virtually everybody's familiar with. And because it's one of the simplest toys, right? Hasn't changed much over the years. It still does the same thing. And one day I just kind of was thinking about it, probably reflecting on my life and what have you. I was just thinking about what all the different elements were, and then the kind of wagon thing came to my mind is that when you think about it, our lives are like a wagon in that you have a handle, and the handle determines the direction of where the wagon is going. Whomever has the handle has the ability to turn it right or left or whatever, right? The front wheels, all right, can turn with the handle. So they're the part of the pulling power that helps the rest of the wagon go along with the handle. Now they can't go without the handle. They follow what the handle does, but they are the driver. So maybe they're the dream or the goal that's pushing us along. All right. And then you have the rear wheels. They don't even know where they're going. The only thing they can see, remember, they don't turn one way or the other. They're on a fixed axle. They only follow the front wheels. That's all they do. All right. And when your kids are little, believe me, that's what they're doing. They're following you as the front. The question is, who's holding the handle? All right. It's kind of like the old poem. If you're a person of faith, where you see there's two sets of footsteps in the stand, and then there's one, and say what happened. Well, that's when Jesus was carried. Well, if your foundational truth is the biblical based foundation, that's really who's the handle. That's where the handle is. Okay, and then you have the cargo holder itself, the red part of the wagon, and that's everything, right? I mean, that's everything in your life. And I break it down into you really have 4 or 5 different wagons. I have my career wagon, I have my family wagon, I have my spiritual wagon, I have my physical health wagon. And where I am at any point in my life in those, I'm not always out there on the handle. And that's what people think. People think, okay, well, here I am. I'm the head of the family. I'm going to be in charge of everything. It just doesn't work like that. Sometimes I've had to crawl in the wagon and Lisa's had to pull because I was at a place in my life where I was hurting or I was in reflection of what's God want me to do. Sometimes, like when I got into politics, okay, I was the rear wheel. My consultant was the front. And I was just following because I didn't really know what to do. All right. And then you'll also have times, and this is something that's tough. Our middle son, Daniel, has autism and epilepsy. Okay. And he does pretty well, but he's 40 years old. We have a living scenario with him here at the house where he's kind of got an independent apartment type thing. But when you have kids, your goal is, well, we're going to raise them up. They're going to go out on their own, and whatever. Well, sometimes those kids are going to crawl in and out of that wagon, and you have to be prepared for that. You can't just say, nope, you're 22 years old or 18 or whatever. And no, sometimes, so he's been in and out of that wagon. And each time that happens, it has an emotional effect on you, right? For him, because you know what he wants for your own self. Okay. Because that's, when you have an adult child that lives with you, that changes your dynamic as well. Right. And so you just have to understand that you're going to be in different parts of those wagons through life. Don't think you're only in one part, and it changes. So that's how I came up with the idea.
I love it. That's really cool. So my last item is I ask people for a parenting hack. Do you have a simple parenting hack you could share with moms or dads of, oh, hey, yeah, this actually worked. It's a simple thing, but try this.
I think the simple parenting hack that I would say is that make memories more important than things. Making memories is more important than things, whatever that is. And it doesn't have to be expensive. Okay. I'm not talking about expensive. I'm talking about, but just your kids will remember the memories, not the things. And so that's the one thing that I would push on people. And if people, want to reach out to me, they can get in touch with me at ron@ronsimmons.com. They're interested in a book. They can get those anywhere on Amazon, or I can send them one. I'm happy to send an autographed copy. So happy to do it.
Very cool. Well, I will put that in the show notes, and I am so appreciative of your time. That's been a real blessing. We accomplished what I had hoped to accomplish, and then some, as you are the most interesting man.
I don't know about that. Thank you very much, Joel. I enjoyed it very much.
All right. Well, God bless.
Okay, have a good day.